I remember standing there with a warm glass in my hand, the chandelier light too bright, the room smelling like wine and polished wood, while I felt myself disappear. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly erased by people who had already decided who I was allowed to be. My chest felt tight, my jaw clenched, and I kept telling myself to breathe as the weight of their assumptions settled in. If you've ever sat in a room where you suddenly realized you didn't matter to the people who should have known you best, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because moments like this happen more often than anyone admits. I was a mother, a woman with decades behind me, yet I felt reduced to a cautionary tale standing at someone else's table. No one raised their voice. No one had to. The humiliation lived in the pauses, the looks, the way the conversation moved past me as if I were furniture. And what they didn't know, not yet, was that everything they believed about me was already wrong. That was the moment everything quietly began to change. I was standing in the middle of my son's dining room when I felt myself shrink, not physically, but in that quiet way that happens when someone decides you are small. I'm 54 years old, and in that moment, surrounded by polished smiles and expensive furniture, I was treated like a temporary inconvenience. The room smelled of wine and perfume, and everything felt too bright. I remember holding a glass in my hand and realizing my fingers were trembling. The people around me weren't raising their voices or pointing fingers. They didn't need to. Their dismissiveness was casual, almost bored, as if my struggles were an amusing footnote to their evening. What hurt most wasn't the wealth on display. It was the familiarity of the faces doing the judging. Family. The people who once needed me, leaned on me, trusted me. I could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing down, reducing years of work, sacrifice, and quiet endurance into a single, humiliating label. I told myself to breathe, to sit still, to swallow the heat rising in my chest. I reminded myself that this was not the first time I had been underestimated, just the most public. What they didn't realize, as they smiled and moved on, was that everything they believed about me was already wrong then. I had slowly become something easy to define and even easier to dismiss. To them, I was the older mother who used to work hard and now didn't quite fit anywhere. Not impressive enough to admire, not struggling enough to pity, just background noise. For decades, my life had been built around responsibility. I worked, raised my son, paid bills on time, showed up when people needed me. None of it was glamorous, but it was solid. Somewhere along the way, solid stopped being valuable. When my job ended, so did the respect that quietly came with it. I could feel the shift in how they looked at me. The questions changed. The pauses got longer. Conversations moved past me instead of including me. I wasn't asked for opinions anymore, only updates, as if my worth could be measured in current usefulness. What hurt wasn't losing status. It was realizing how conditional their kindness had become. I was still the same woman who taught my son right from wrong, who held things together when money was tight, who believed dignity mattered even when no one was watching. But to them, I had become a cautionary example. A reminder of what happens when you fall behind, and standing there, absorbing their assumptions. I knew they were seeing only the surface of my life, not the truth quietly waiting underneath. It all. I hadn't walked into that dinner empty-handed, even though it looked that way. Earlier that morning, my phone rang while I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, still trying to figure out my next step. The call came from someone I barely knew, connected to a part of my family that had faded into silence decades ago. I remember listening, barely breathing. As the meaning settled in, A relative I hadn't seen since childhood was gone, and somehow, I was the one left holding what remained. It didn't feel like good fortune. It felt unreal, heavy, like being handed a responsibility I hadn't asked for. I sat there after the call ended, staring at the wall, waiting for the shock to wear off. It didn't. I went through the rest of the day on autopilot, driving, dressing, showing up, while my mind replayed the same thought over and over. Nothing was the same anymore, even if nothing looked different. By the time I stood in that dining room, absorbing their quiet judgment, I was already living in a different reality. They saw a woman who had fallen behind. What they couldn't see was that my life had already cracked open. I wasn't hiding anything out of spite. I simply hadn't found the words yet. I carried that knowledge silently, like a secret that changed how I breathed, how I listened, how I watched them talk so confidently about things they assumed I would never touch. They believed the story they had written for me, unaware that it ended. At some point, the sting faded and something else took its place. I stopped shrinking and started watching. I let the room move around me while I stayed still, listening without reacting, noticing details I would have missed if I'd stayed hurt. They spoke with pride, the kind that comes from never being questioned. Success was described like a game they had mastered, one where other people existed only as numbers or obstacles. I could hear the satisfaction in how easily they talked about growth, expansion, winning. It was all framed as intelligence and courage, never consequence. As I listened, a pattern emerged. The confidence was casual, almost lazy. They assumed everyone at the table admired them, agreed with them, shared their values. No one thought twice about how those victories were achieved or who paid the price. Certainly no one expected the quiet woman at the edge of the conversation to be paying attention. My anger sharpened into clarity. This wasn't just arrogance. It was entitlement wrapped in charm. I thought about how easily people like me are dismissed, how that dismissal creates blind spots. They were so busy performing success that they didn't notice what they were revealing. I felt something settle inside me then. Not rage, not revenge, awareness. I understood that my silence had shifted. It wasn't weakness anymore. It was cover. Every proud detail they offered, every careless assumption, was information handed to me freely. By the time dessert arrived, I knew this evening had already changed course, even if I was the only one who realized it. When I finally got home, the noise of that evening followed me into the quiet. I sat alone and let everything replay, not as scenes, but as feelings. The looks, the assumptions, the ease with which they dismissed me. I had spent so many years telling myself it was better to stay calm, to keep the peace, to let things slide. That night, for the first time, I questioned that habit. I asked myself when endurance had quietly turned into permission, when staying silent stopped being strength and started becoming surrender. The answer unsettled me, because it meant I had helped maintain the very pattern that hurt me. Fear showed up immediately. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of what would happen if I stopped playing the role they were comfortable assigning me. I knew how to survive by shrinking. I had done it before. It was familiar, almost safe. But something had shifted. I could feel it in my chest, steady and unignorable. This wasn't about anger or proving anything. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about accountability, about drawing a line and deciding that quiet cruelty no longer deserved my patience. I thought about who I was becoming if I stayed silent again. That image felt heavier than the risk of speaking up. I realized that dignity isn't loud. It's deliberate. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to choose it. By the time I went to bed, The decision was already made. I wasn't going to confront them emotionally or dramatically. I was going to move carefully, thoughtfully, and on my own terms. And tomorrow, I would start taking control quietly. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn anyone. I simply began. The morning after that decision, I treated my life like something worth protecting. I made appointments, took notes, asked careful questions, and listened more than I spoke. For once, patience worked in my favor. On the outside, nothing changed. I still woke up early, ran errands, made dinner, and answered messages politely. Inside, everything was reorganizing. Each small step gave me steadiness. Each answered question replaced fear with clarity. I wasn't rushing. I was building. I learned where to place trust and where to keep distance. I paid attention to details I used to ignore. Paperwork stopped feeling intimidating and started feeling grounding. It reminded me that structure exists for moments exactly like this, when emotion needs a container. There was a quiet satisfaction in doing things correctly, not secretly, not dishonestly, just thoughtfully. I wasn't trying to surprise anyone. I was preparing myself. I could feel my posture change, my voice settle, my thoughts slow down and sharpen at the same time. What surprised me most was how familiar this discipline felt. I had done this kind of work before, back when people depended on me and expected competence. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that version of myself. Now she was back, calm and unshakable. By the end of that week, I understood something important. Control doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with readiness. And while everyone else continued to see the same quiet woman they had dismissed, I had already moved far past where they thought I was. The balance had begun to tilt. Even if no one could see it yet, I felt steady, patient, and certain, knowing the next moment would reveal how quietly prepared strength eventually changes everything for people watching later. I noticed the change before anyone said anything. It showed up in pauses, in messages that felt more careful, in a sudden hesitation where confidence used to live. The energy had shifted, and even though no one acknowledged it, I could feel it clearly. People who once spoke over me now seemed unsure how to approach me. There was a new caution in their tone, a subtle recalculation happening behind their eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. And that's how I knew it was real. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel giddy or vindictive. I felt steady, centered. The humiliation from before no longer had weight because I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply reclaimed myself. Power looks different when it shifts. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in restraint. I found that I didn't need to correct anyone or explain anything. Their discomfort did that work for me. They were beginning to sense that the story they believed was incomplete, and that unsettled them. I thought back to that first dinner, to how small I felt sitting there, absorbing their certainty. Now, the memory felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I was still quiet, still polite, still myself, but the ground underneath had changed. There was relief in that realization, not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to endure. I had clarity, and clarity creates authority without force. I understood then that the balance had already tipped, even if the full reckoning hadn't arrived yet, and I knew it would arrive soon. There was another dinner coming, another moment where we would sit across from each other again. This time, though, we wouldn't be meeting on the same terms. I invited them to my home the following week. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal at my own table. The space was modest, familiar to me, and for once, I felt grounded instead of exposed. When they arrived, I noticed the hesitation immediately. Their confidence didn't fill the room the way it had before. As we sat down, the air felt tight. Movements were careful. Smiles didn't quite land. I kept my voice calm and my posture relaxed, letting the contrast speak for itself. This wasn't the grand setting where I had been quietly diminished. This was my space, and that mattered more than I expected. I thought about the first dinner, how small I felt surrounded by their certainty. Now, the memory sharpened my focus instead of my pain. When I finally shared what had changed in my life, I did it plainly, without drama. I watched their expressions shift as understanding settled in, not all at once, but piece by piece. There was no argument, just silence, heavy and revealing. I could sense the weight of their assumptions collapsing under the truth they hadn't bothered to imagine. Shame flickered, followed by confusion, then something closer to humility. I didn't raise my voice or seek apologies. I let the moment stand on its own. Authority doesn't need volume, it needs steadiness. I felt no urge to explain myself further because the clarity was already there, unmistakable. As the evening ended, I realized this wasn't a conclusion. It was a correction. The power had shifted, not to punish, but to rebalance what had been broken. I cleaned up after they left with a quiet resolve, knowing this dinner was only the beginning of what I would do next, and I was ready to move forward without fear or hesitation anymore. After that dinner, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. The tension drained out slowly, replaced by a quiet sense of direction. I understood that what mattered now wasn't what had been said, but what I chose to build from that point forward. I started making decisions that reflected my values instead of my wounds. I focused on stability, on creating a future that felt honest and sustainable. Every choice was filtered through one question. Does this align with who I want to be? Not who I was forced to defend. I put energy into repairing what could be repaired and releasing what couldn't. Some relationships softened, not because apologies were spoken, but because behavior shifted. Boundaries became visible, and respect followed them naturally. I didn't push for closeness, and I didn't withdraw either. I stayed steady. My idea of success changed. It stopped being about proving strength and started being about practicing it. Legacy, I realized, isn't about control or admiration. It's about consistency, about showing up with integrity even when no one is watching. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The sharp edges dulled. Conversations felt more balanced. I noticed myself breathing easier, sleeping better, trusting my own judgment again. Looking back, that confrontation was only a doorway. What mattered was everything that came after it. The quiet work, the intentional choices, the way time carried those decisions forward and turned them into something lasting. It felt earned, grounded, and finally fully my own again. Time passed in a quiet, steady way. The sharpness of that night faded, and with distance, the pain softened into something I could hold without flinching. What once felt raw now felt resolved. My days became simpler. Mornings were calm. I cooked, read, took walks, and noticed how my body no longer carried constant tension. Peace showed up in small places, like breathing fully or sleeping through the night without replaying conversations in my head. Relationships adjusted themselves. Some grew more respectful, measured, careful. Others stayed distant. And I learned that distance doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it's just honesty. I stopped chasing understanding and let consistency speak instead. What surprised me most was how little I needed validation anymore. The chaos that once demanded answers had settled into quiet acceptance. I didn't need to be right. I just needed to be grounded. Looking back, The contrast was striking. I moved from feeling diminished to feeling whole, not because anyone changed for me, but because I changed for myself. I chose calm over conflict and dignity over defense. That was the real aftermath, not applause or apologies, but steadiness, a life that felt balanced again. And standing in that calm, I've spent a long time thinking about what that experience taught me. It wasn't about money or status or even family conflict. It was about dignity and how easily it gets taken away when people decide your value for you. For a while, I believed staying quiet was the same as staying strong. I thought endurance was kindness. What I learned is that silence can protect peace, but it can also protect harm. There's a moment when choosing yourself is not selfish. It's necessary. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. Power doesn't come from proving anything. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let others reduce you. When you move from that place, you don't need to fight. You simply stand. I want to thank you for listening to this story. Sharing something personal takes trust, and giving your time takes generosity. It means more than I can easily say. Stories like these remind me that quiet people often carry the deepest histories, and that listening, truly listening, can restore empathy in places where judgment once lived and bring dignity back into conversations that forgot it. If any part of this felt familiar, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, or treated like you didn't matter? How did it change you? Or what do you wish you had done differently? Leave a comment if you feel comfortable. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if this resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. I read every comment, and I'm grateful you're here.